Hello, everyone. Tennis Weekly here. Big breaking news for Saturday morning. So big, we have had to jump on an emergency Tennis Weekly podcast. World number one, Jannik Sinner, has been banned for 3 months, an immediate ban after reaching a settlement with WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, over his two positive drug tests from last year surrounding, I'm going to say it right, colostabol. He will be back for the French Open. He will be back for Rome in front of his home crowd. But Chris, we're jumping on the pod because we need to dissect all of this because it's got all of the tennis world talking. When this news dropped, what was your immediate reaction?
I have to say, my first reaction was surprise that now there seems to be a precedent where you're able just to settle these things. I didn't know that the player had so much power in these negotiations now. But I mean, am I genuinely surprised by the fact that this is what's happened? No. Am I very, very disappointed? Yes. I mean, the more I read, the more it makes the questions bigger around the integrity of the sport, the integrity of what happened here, and the nature of preferential treatment. Because, I feel like it's one thing to say this is a ban, but then you look into the details of it, and it probably is the most preferential ban that Jannik Sinner could possibly have envisaged when it came to the fact that he was likely to get a ban, and that it was likely to be a period of ineligibility. So, I mean, if you're a Jannik Sinner fan, you should be rejoicing because this is almost unbelievable when you look at what it could have
Do,
been.
do you think he is just kind of coming into it? Do you think he is the big winner actually of this situation?
Oh, this is huge. It's huge for him. I mean, rejoicing. I think his lawyer used the word delighted, which is really quite strange given the nature of the accusations and what we're looking at here. For me personally, it feels like almost a case where this settlement was, they called up and said, oh, we don't really want to do the ban of 1 to 2 years that WADA's asking for. Could we do something less? And they're like, okay, well, how does 6 months sound? He goes, no. What about 3 months? And they say 3 months from April was probably when things were looking at the trial happening in Lausanne at the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And then Yannick goes, maybe no, actually. I'd like to play the French Open and Wimbledon. Don't want to miss a slam. And they say, okay, well, how about coming back at the French Open? And then it's even like, no, you can come back at home in Rome to get a warm up in. It couldn't be better.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I feel like the last we heard of this, it was kind of like hearing in April. There were some sounding boards of around kind of WADA were pushing for 1 to 2 years. So from that, it does sort of feel like they've had to kind of climb down for what they ultimately were gunning for. And again, I guess it does bring up that theme and that question on like who's got the power, who's got the control here, and how have we got to a situation maybe where it feels like bans or suspensions, they can be almost like negotiated. And is that, that's the sort of general kind of consensus I'm getting from the community, hearing some of the responses. But do you feel like there's been some sort of maybe negotiation where the reality is these sorts of things, these should be non-negotiable?
They should be. This was pretty much an open and shut case that if anyone who is kind of very much invested in doping in sport and clean sport, they will know that this hinges on the no fault or negligence or this no significant fault or negligence. And so what was initially found that this was no fault or negligence, which anybody in the know would be very much aware that if you have two positive tests and it's because of something your team has done, that does not mean there's no fault because your team is an extension of you. And that's something that in Yannick's statement, he is saying he did know and he does accept. So I think that's where it's so strange because it wouldn't be hard to prove that this was very much avoidable. There was something the player could do to avoid this. And the 1 to 2 year ban is very much what I thought would be happening if it reached that point. And I was hoping it wouldn't end up being, a 3 month brush it under the carpet, no harm done here. Because when it comes to this case, we're not even talking about performance enhancing at this point, because it's almost so irrelevant to the fact that all of the nature of what's gone on behind the scenes and the way that the different authorities have handled it have actually really been almost like a knife in the heart of the tennis community and the clean athletes competing on the tour, because it does depend on who you are. It does depend on whether you're an Iga Swiatek or Jannik Sinner lawyered up to the gods with infinite resources, because this is not the treatment that someone like Tara Moore had. And it's also not the treatment that Simona Halep had, or Maria Sharapova. And so there are lots of question marks that I have around that element of things, because, you know, we had almost a year Simona Halep was waiting to have a hearing.
Yeah.
Jannik Sinner got his suspension lifted within a couple of
effectively
days.
ruined her career, really.
It did. And I think you have to put into question, if the same thing had happened to Jannik Sinner and he wasn't able to explain away the contamination, then he wouldn't have had the best year of his career and one of the best years we've ever seen from a player on the tour. It would have really stopped his momentum having a significant ban or a significant wait for a hearing. And actually, he's been able to win 2 more Grand Slams whilst facing no real penalties up until that point and still be able to compete in every single slam. I mean, that really does ask a lot of questions about the integrity of sport right now.
And just on that, I mean, if we look at it like Jannik Sinner, you know, he's going to feel like he's, you know, come out of this relatively unscathed. What does this look like for WADA in terms of their kind of stature in sport, their integrity, as you said? This feeling maybe that like we're seeing examples like this that suggest like they can be influenced, they can be negotiated. You know, climbing down from almost like a watered down suspension of 3 months. Does it feel like with this news that WADA's stature and credibility, has it sort of taken a knock a little bit, do you think?
I think a lot of these different institutions and their credibility have taken a knock. I mean, for me, the biggest knock isn't actually with WADA and the settlement of this. I actually think it's the initial findings and the initial way it was handled. The fact that so quickly it was explained away and there was very short suspensions that were given, that were lifted. So he was able to still compete. I think for me, it's statements like this from Karen Morehouse, the ITIA's chief executive, at the time that they announced that the investigation was wrapped up last August. And they said, following that investigation, the ITIA accepted the player's explanation as to the source of colostabol and that the presence of the substance was not intentional. This was also accepted by the tribunal. We thank the independent tribunal for the speed and clarity in its decision in relation to this player's degree of fault. And you just think, I'm not a doping expert, but I also know that you can't say that there's no fault in this case at any point. But that's what everybody, all of the authorities were pretending at the time last year. And then WADA are the only people who've actually at least slightly held him to account. I mean, they were pushing for 1 to 2 years.
Yep.
They were pushing for there to be a ban. And normally they don't actually appeal the decision made by the ITIA. And if they do, it's normally quite rare that they would go into that. I think the ATP also has people to answer for. And I think you can probably tell, Joel, I'm quite impassioned by this because I do just really not understand how we got to this point. But the ATP said at the end of last year, about end of August, just before the US Open, when the initial findings were reported, we're encouraged that no fault or negligence has been found on Jannik Sinner's part. We would also like to acknowledge the robustness of the investigation process and independent evaluation of the facts under the tennis anti-doping program. They go on to say, anti-doping program, which allowed him to continue competing. This has been challenging for Jannik and his team and underscores the need for players and their entourages to take the utmost care in the use of products or treatments. Integrity is paramount to the sport. And that is what this hinges on for me, Joel, is that integrity is not at the paramount, it's not paramount to the sport. For a lot of these institutions, it's actually the way that the perception and of tennis is, it's much more the brand of tennis is what they're protecting, and it's not necessarily the integrity of the sport.
Yeah, and I guess to WADA's credit, as you said, like the ITIA, it almost feels like they were trying to sweep it under the covers, and WADA were actually like, not having that. They were actually trying to pull it, you know, bring it back and make more of it of an issue of it. So there should be, I think, credit there for sort of forcing the kind of the difficult questions. I mean, obviously it is their responsibility and that's the role of their organization. I mean, just listening to the Jannik Sinner team and their statement.
Mm.
I'm gonna read it now because we need to get both sides of the argument. So he said the statement came out saying Jannik Sinner has come to an agreement with WADA, acknowledging his partial responsibility for the errors made by his team. As a result, he will face a 3-month suspension from tennis. WADA's investigation concluded that Sinner had no intent and did not derive any competitive advantage from the 2 positive tests for minimal traces of colostabol detected in his system. I just wanted to kind of talk about this idea of partial responsibility. It's sort of not him, it was more his team. And to me, it's almost like if you were to sort of try and, I guess, justify why it's only been 3 months, I guess there are going to be people, there are going to be Sinner fans maybe saying, well, hang on, it wasn't him directly, it was his team. Now, again, I think this opens up this debate on like, who are you responsible for as the athlete? Are you responsible for just for yourself, or are you responsible for yourself and your team? If your team does something that you don't know about, are you still responsible for that? Where do you kind of stand on this issue? Because I do feel like one of the reasons you could argue it is 3 months is because from the words of the words that are coming out, it suggests that Sinner has basically had no idea that this was happening.
I think it's exposes a potential loophole in the doping legislation that exists. And I think that could also be a reason why WADA did settle, because the interpretation of a particular clause around where the responsibility lies, whether it's your team or yourself, if it was 100% found to be at the fault of the player, therefore it would mean a ban would be much likely to be longer. But I think because of the nature of that could be interpreted in one of 2 ways, I think this is why there was a meet in the middle potentially. But ultimately, what it does say is that your team are an extension of you. And so when it came to Sharapova's ban, which I think you can't necessarily draw comparisons in doping cases, but you can make comparisons by what went on in them. I mean, the nature of what the substance is, the nature of how long someone was taking it before, we have to put aside for the comparison. But Sharapova received an email. Her team are responsible. Her doctors did not also pick this up either. That this was the same product, had a different name that she was using, Medonium. It was given to her by her doctor, is what she said. And she said that she had to take responsibility for the fact that her team did not make her aware of this and the people that she hires to look after this. So she went down the team route, and it feels like that is the route that you do go down if you would like to get something sorted in a more preferable way for you. But she was given 2 years was the initial period, and she was suspended immediately. So I think, I mean,
and she had to accept it. There was no, it didn't, it felt like that era. It was just, you just had to take it on the chin and accept it. And there was no real sort of leeway to give. You just had to sort of fess up, own up, and take the punishment. And yeah, it almost
it's very
feels
different, isn't it?
It's very different.
She said, she held a press conference and was like, look, this happened. She announced it. She chose to announce it. And this feels like it's all been about the PR game. And I think when it comes to this statement of partial responsibility, blaming it on his team, I mean, his team have now joined Matteo Berrettini's camp. They work with him now. So I just think that there are no consequences really for the team because they've been kept in employment by Italian tennis. But also when it comes to blaming your team, you have to make it seem like that because otherwise the PR... Yeah,
you've got to protect the asset.
You do, exactly. And so I think that this is... I mean, I did not think at any moment that this would become such a reality where a player could negotiate such a positive way of looking at and a positive outcome for 2 failed doping tests.
I mean, are we really going to feel his absence on the tour? Because he is going to be back for the French Open. He is going to be back for Rome. So he will get a lead up tournament in front of his home fans, no less. So I can almost imagine them sort of, welcoming back their champion. Do you really? Yeah. Do you feel like we're going to feel the impact of missing the world number 1? I guess we won't see him for the Sunshine Swing, Indian Wells, and Miami. But beyond that, it just doesn't feel like. I look at the events of what he's missing. It's still a pretty good outcome, isn't it?
I mean, as I said at the start, it's almost like he called up and said, "Look, I don't want to miss Grand
It's almost
Slams.
made the world number one race more interesting.
Well, I mean, he still isn't definitely going to lose the world #1 ranking. That's how ridiculous this is because he was already
Mm,
stripped of his Indian Wells points and prize money last year because of that was where he had the first
mm,
positive test result. So, I mean, he's not like he's defending points from both of them. He did win Miami, so there is 1,000 points to defend there. But it's like he scheduled it, booked a vacation, and said, "Look, I'm going to come back in Rome to a hero's welcome, and then I'm going to move on." But I'm also shocked by what I've seen online in terms of Sinner fans thinking that it's not Sinner's fault, it's his team's fault. He did nothing wrong. And that's what Sinner's always said. So taking any form of responsibility now and saying, partial responsibility when he said he did nothing wrong and
mm.
claimed his innocence throughout, and how hard this has been for him when ultimately this has probably been the least hard doping situation I've ever seen for someone who has failed multiple tests because the repercussions have been so limited.
I mean, just at this point, I do want to kind of bring in some other perspectives, the perspectives of other tennis players. And there isn't a tennis player that is more vocal than Nick Kyrgios. And it's quite interesting. He has been very animated, as you can imagine, over the last several hours on his feed. I'm just going to read you some of the tweets on his profile. He actually opened in full caps, dodgy as. With a couple of emojis, and then it got a little bit more kind of into an argument. So WADA come out and say it would be a 1 to 2 year ban. Obviously, Sinner's team have done everything in their power to just go ahead and take a 3-month ban. No titles lost, no prize money lost. Guilty or not? Question mark. Sad day for tennis. Fairness in tennis does not exist. I know a lot of players that are feeling the same way at the moment. So looking to hold live spaces next week so we can talk about it. Stay tuned for exact time. And then he just sort of tweeted, "Bad day for tennis." How do you think the players are going to be reacting, to this news? Do you think they'll be in this sort of Nick Kyrgios camp? Do you think the locker room's going to feel different when, like, Jannik Sinner, I guess, he comes back onto the tour? Will he just be accepted back because, he's served his time and everyone moves on? Or do you think there is going to be a hangover for it? It doesn't feel like Nick Kyrgios is going to be forgetting this anytime soon.
Well, I actually think that Nick has been pretty explosive in what he's tweeted previously. And I think there is a real sadness in his tweets because this is a really sad day for tennis. It's a sad day for the tennis community because the integrity of the sport and the transparency of the sport when it comes to these sorts of doping cases and doping offences, I mean, it's in an absolute shambles. I mean, it really is. This has been a mockery of how these things should be handled. And for someone who is an athlete, you can see why they would be so disappointed, like Nick Kyrgios, by the fact that there is no fairness because you see multiple different ways things are handled from Halep to Sharapova. And there is no real justice or comeuppance for the fact there is this doping test. So I think what's strange is that everyone has been so much on Jannik Sinner's side, from like the Jack Drapers to the Alcarazes, a lot of people talking about people's character. And I think that maybe they will be pleased that there has been a ban. They can say that he served his time and they can move on from it. But I don't really think anyone will be changing particularly their stance on it because people who made their stance clear, you would have a problem from the off when he wasn't actually suspended for a significant period of time and that was lifted. So this is more the final nail in a coffin for people who are looking for sport to genuinely be clean and for the checks and balances and the measures to protect clean athletes. This is probably a really tough day for them. And I think that speaks by the fact there were not many expletives in his tweets today.
No, I did enjoy actually that before all this kind of broke, that his previous tweet for that was just Wu-Tang forever.
I did keep scrolling as well. I was like,
it's quite funny.
I was like, was this in relation to the Wu-Tang? But I would ask you, yes, Joel.
Sorry. I was just going to say, just on the perspective of players, I guess one other thing to kind of think about in the dynamic is the lower ranked players, because, I was reading kind of Liam Brodie, British tennis player. He said, didn't realize you could reach a settlement regarding a doping ban. Interesting. Back in time for French Open, I guess, question mark. Now, we've sort of talked about this idea of being able to negotiate now for a ban, but where does this leave this idea of special treatment and the top players getting something that is not afforded to lower ranked or less or lower profile players? Because again, is this like the the smoking gun, as it were, in terms of like just showing how big that chasm is. The fact that Jannik Sinner, world number one, has negotiated down maybe to 3 months, whereas someone like Tara Moore, for example, was just left in, well, felt like constant limbo forever and ever, and she's still, I guess, trying to recoup her earnings. How do you think, like, yeah, the lower ranked players will be seeing this?
I mean, very, very disheartening. I think the fact, I mean, I agree with Liam Brody. I did not know until the Iga Swiatek case that you could negotiate a deal that worked for you. And her deal was that she wouldn't miss the end of season finals or the Billie Jean King Cup. And then the rest of her suspension would be served pretty much during her off season. So that 1 month ban was absolutely nothing. It was not felt for her either, apart from losing her number one ranking by not being able to compete in the Asian swing. In this case, again, barely anything has been felt by the top players. It is a case where if you have the resources, if you are part of the institution of tennis, and if your integrity is important to the integrity of sport, then I think there are different ways of handling things. Because on paper, as you say, this was an open and shut case. It was 1 to 2 years. Halep was given 4 years that then got reduced to 9 months, but she had a period of much longer than that. And Sharapova was given 2 years. So I think, is something really shifting. I don't want to say there's necessarily significant sexism in this, but it does feel like whoever is in charge of these institutions now, something has changed where they actually aren't holding these players to account. They are very much looking for ways to get to positive outcomes whilst not upsetting the apple cart or the financial backers of tennis too much, whilst at the same time looking like, from an outward perception, that they are doing something to keep the sport clean. But if you're a lower ranked player, I mean, the incentive to compete and be clean has to remain, because you won't be afforded the same luxury as some of these top players who have the top lawyers and people protecting them. So, I mean, I'm a little bit shocked by this in terms of the fact that it is such a favourable time period. I did think there would be a Grand Slam missed. In terms of sort of someone who maybe hasn't read all of the things across the whole time, Joel, surely this feels like it's been handled differently. And what I can't understand is, why is it such a different way of handling it from the cases we've seen previously?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think others being world number one and having so many, I guess, different stakeholders in your game.
Even the Grand Slams are stakeholders, I guess,
yeah,
right?
perhaps are influencing, because he's such a big deal. He's such a fan favorite that he can make or break tournaments. But I think that might have something to do with it. I do wonder if, as I say, over time, players have realised maybe their influence and their persuasiveness more. And we've seen more frequent examples of kind of top players in these types of situations. And I do wonder if kind of like a precedent has been set. You spoke about Iga Swiatek, and it's kind of like, well, if it's already happening there, then why can't it happen for other kind of big name players? Whereas I think maybe before, when in kind of, with Maria Sharapova, it didn't feel like it was happening as frequently. So it felt like you just had to maybe just accept it, take it on the chin, and there was no leeway. But I think for me, this shows the influence and the power that the players have. And it's interesting that there are going to be people out there who say, well, he got a suspension, but at the same time, he's innocent, or like there's kind of like this sort of conflict of information here of like how to sort of frame, like, he's innocent, or like it's his team. It's not him, it's his team. And yet, at the same time, he's going to have to take time off the tennis court.
And I think it does seem like we're going back to sort of the 90s era when it comes to this, because, I mean, Agassi returned a positive drugs test. There was investigations done by sort of the same institutions that govern things now. He was given a 3-month suspension, but the punishment was not formally handed down because he blamed it on a spiked drink. And we're back into these, like, do you believe the excuses? Do you believe this? And then he later admitted he did take the substance that he was accused of. But it feels like he had a lot of power in 1997, and it feels like there was a wave where people were being held to account, but it feels like it's now sort of shifted the other way and we're erring on the side of the player rather than the side of the integrity of sport.
How do you think the fans will accept Jannik Sinner when he does come back to the tennis court? I almost actually think, like, as I say, like coming back in Rome, in my head, it's going to feel like, if assuming he does come back in Rome, it's going to feel like nothing has changed. The Italian crowd are going to go wild. They're going to cheer. They're going to cheer for the champion's return. That's sort of how I'm envisioning it, like gladiator-esque, Russell Crowe, big pantheon in the Colosseum. But how do you think what do you think the reality is going to be when he does come back to the tour from the fan point of view?
I think the reality is that you're able to allow yourself to just believe Jannik Sinner. And I think this is what happens with doping cases is that he said he's done nothing wrong. He's now said it's his team's fault. You know, he's very much said he's done nothing wrong. So if you are a fan, you will believe your player. And so I think if you are a passionate Italian fan, you will think this is actually not fair that he got the ban, but you'll be pleased that he is very much back on the tour in Rome. If you are someone else, you would have already had a problem before now because you would have thought, hang on a minute, why is this treatment different? When there are two positive tests, why was this different to some of the cases I've already mentioned? And it's a bit like, you know, when we talk about Zverev, some people know about what went down with some of the allegations against him. Some people don't, but it isn't necessarily something that's as widely known as it should be in the sport. I think a lot of people just like watching Jannik Sinner play, and a lot of people will allow sort of this incident to kind of be forgotten so they can enjoy the Carlos Alcaraz, Jannik Sinner era of tennis. And they'll be pleased that there is a solution, there is resolution for people, and that everyone can move on. But I think there will be a hangover for the integrity of tennis and for clean athletes everywhere.
Okay, we're going to wrap up very, very soon. But I guess one question I want to ask and end on is, what can we learn? What can tennis learn from this whole situation? Because it now, regardless of if people like it or not, it has now concluded and ended. What can tennis learn from this Jannik Sinner incident?
Well, I think we talked about it was very strange that Iga Swiatek was not on the tour during China, especially when we knew how much she wanted to keep that #1 ranking. So I would say be very aware if there is any period where you do not see one of your favorite players playing. I also think if you are someone who is pushing the boundaries of what is legal in sport, I mean, this is almost a case study to follow. Have a reason that you're able to give immediately if you return or are notified of a positive test result. Make sure it's not associated with you, and then hire the same lawyer that Jannik Sinner had. I think that's the problem, is that the only learnings are that you can get around things and that it's no longer career ending to have a failed doping test on the tour. It's almost the playbook for how to not get away with it. I think that's probably one step too far, but how to get the best solution. Minimize. Exactly that.
Well, there you go, listeners. That is the Tennis Weekly take. The immediate fallout from the Jannik Sinner 3-month ban. We're going to be back on Monday for our regular tour catch up when we're going to be continuing the fallout on that episode. So I hope you can join us for that. Of course, let us know, what are your opinions on this case? Comment, get involved with us on Twitter. A lot of people already have.
Keep it friendly, please.
Keep it friendly. But we'll be addressing some of those comments as well in our tour catch up episode on Monday. But I do hope you've enjoyed this breaking edition episode from me and Chris, and we'll see you again soon.